Hello, this is the second video in a series about grassland ecology that was originally presented to the Colorado Native Plant Society in December of 2020. So we are going to discuss plant identification in the Pikes Peak area. Here in Colorado, there are 3 books that I highly recommend. Weber and Whitman, The Colorado Flora, Eastern and Western Slope. These are the classic texts of Colorado botany. But in the new millennium, we have seen a rising author, Jennifer Ackerfield, with the Colorado State University Herbarium. And most people use the Flora of Colorado now, which was originally published in 2015. And then, of course, anyone associated with the Denver Botanic Gardens is familiar with the work of Jan Wingate, and she has several very affordable, simple guides that help you to become more comfortable with plant anatomy and using a dichotomous key in a limited framework of a certain plant type, like wildflowers or grasses or weeds. All right, now as you move forward in your life as a botanist, it is really helpful to get a grasp of the vocabulary. So I urge you to pause the video here and take a screenshot of this diagram. There are also diagrams in all the books that I just mentioned. There will be 2 parts of grasses that I'll focus on a lot, and one is the ligule, which is this sheath between the leaf blade and the stem. And then I'll also be focusing on the inflorescence variety, so understanding whether or not the inflorescence is coming right off the stem, as in a spike, if it is borne on individual footstalks called pedicels, this is a raceme, or if it's a panicle, a seed head with a main axis and subdivided branches. These are quick groups that you can put grasses into in the identification process. So here we go. Without further ado, we're going to run through about a dozen species. And the first is Indian ricegrass. Indian ricegrass, let me just stop for just 1 second and say that I am a restoration ecologist, so I'm sorry if I don't sound like the most botanically literate human being. I am not. I am a person who joined Colorado Native Plant Society to learn more about grasses because my new research sites were in grasslands, but my theoretical foundation is restoration ecology. So people sometimes appreciate my common vernacular. It might annoy you, but before I get going, I don't want to sound like the expert. I am just a person trying to learn like everybody else. So first, let's look at the Indian ricegrass. Indian ricegrass was a very important species to indigenous folks in the region, and it is a species that I've seen in very dry and inhospitable places, like on the edge of dry slopes, falling off of trail sides, a lot in Salida, which I classify as an inland desert. It's so dry. And the Indian ricegrass has this open panicle. So if you look in the lower right, you'll see the grass and then its reflection on the paper. And you'll be able to see that each inflorescence, each floret is borne onto its own stem, which is borne from other stems. And although it emerges, now looking on the left side, rolling out of the blade, where it can be kind of tight and packaged up as it matures, that really opens up. And so on the right again, this is late season. And then what you will find at the end of each of those pedicels is a black seed with tons of hairs. It's very, very hairy, and you just have to look closely to see also that the seed is very black, and these are very unique characteristics for grasses of the region. And so if you see a plant with black seeds surrounded by a hairy inflorescence, then Oh, definitely you have an Indian ricegrass. Now notice here that the blade is gently sloping from the node, and that there is a papery ligule inside of this junction between the blade and the stem. So that's Indian ricegrass. Now let's look at big bluestem, Andropogon gerardii. This is going to be the tallest grass in your landscape. Irrigation might alter that to some extent. Often found in places where water aggregates. For example, in the Garden of the Gods, there's a lot of big bluestem, like in parking lot islands, where the water is sheeting towards them. And what is very characteristic about the inflorescence is there are 3 spikelets born into what looks like a turkey foot. Also notice there's so many beautiful colors. So these yellow things hanging down are the actual petals of grasses are flowers. And so these are the inflorescence. And also you notice that there's a lot of red, and it's also hairy if you can see these fine but long hairs sticking out. Now let's take a look here at the ligule here. Notice that there's a pinching, that is a defining characteristic. And there's a color change right there. It's very light in color at the node where the blade leaves the stem. And then in the end of the season, the whole thing kind of turns red, and it's very beautiful. And so I would say turkey foot, 3 spikelets, and the largest grass in your landscape most likely. Now we'll look at a very low grass, the purple three-awn, and as it is aptly named, there are 3 awns coming off of each glume, and the awn is this, it doesn't have to be very long, but it has some function in seed transport. But in the case of the purple three-awn, these are very long. There's no other grass I can think of where there are 3 equidistant awns coming off of each bloom. As you can see, the plant itself is fairly petite. It is also pretty low. In like the early morning, it can really catch a lot of dew and be kind of sparkly. Here also we see that there's no dramatic branching, no dramatic angles in the blades as they emerge from the stem. It's all pretty much going in the same direction. So there's purple three-awn. And now we have Sideoats grama, Bouteloua curtipendula. This is such a beautiful grass, and it is also very delicate, but it's of a mid-height. And this is an example of a raceme. The glooms are borne on individual pedicels as they go up the stalk, but there's no secondary branching, so it's not a panicle. And here we notice for the first time that right at the departure of the blade from the stem at the ligule and node, there is angulation here. The leaf kind of juts out. It also curls to a tip. And as we can see in the far right, there's pronounced venation, and it's very hairy. And the stem is red. Notice how the stem is red. And when the Sideoats grama senesces, it senesces even more to a reddish color as the season goes on. This is, as the name implies, but this picture does not perfectly demonstrate. The glooms are all hanging to one side, and so it's called Sideoats grama. And now let's look at blue grama, Bouteloua gracilis. This is the Colorado state grass. And here we have a different kind of setup. We have a spike, and you can notice it's very hairy still. And this whole structure is composed of many glooms. This is a floret, whereas in the Sideoats, it was just individual glooms. Now the blue grama, quite noticeably, look at this reflection on the paper. Here it is in real life. We have a color change at the node, and we have a lot of hair. There's a lot of white hair sticking out here, and you can see it again at this lower node, and that is characteristic of the blue grama. There are robust flowers. It all does hang to one side, and you can see that in the picture. These are the petals here, and this is the floret. And then also notice that as it senesces to a gray color, and the leaves kind of curl, and this is not at all like the grasses I just described. It's very soft and fine, and the stature is of mid-stature, depending on moisture availability, of course. And then we call this the eyelash grass because when the grass senesces, the florets curl into what looks like an eyelash shape. And there you can see the relative structure of it. The grass itself is pretty low lying, and then the stalks are protruding up between 6 and 1 foot, 6 inches and 1 foot. Then see there the node, we see the color change again. We see a little ribbing in the node right above the blade. Characteristics of the blue grama. This is a codominant species in Colorado with the buffalograss, Bouteloua dactyloides. Now, the buffalograss is even more petite than the blue grama, and it is very low lying. Notice here how low the inflorescence is to the ground. That's only a couple of inches. And also notice we don't have any color change going on here, but what we do have is a lot of protruding grass or hairs. It's kind of like a 5 o'clock shadow, but look at how long they can get. And you can see that over here in the picture on the right. There is pubescence all over the blade, and it's kind of fine, like a teenager's new beard or something like that. And then also notice here, you may have noticed that the petal color in some of the other species we looked at was yellow, but in the buffalograss, it's this beautiful rose color. And as the grass senesces, it all, turns white, and you can see it curls up like the blue grama. And if you think about it, these codominant species, they really increase the carbon matter in the soil, so it leads to soil development. And they are also connected by their root systems, so they're mat-forming grasses. Helps to hold stabilized soil. So here we have Bromus inermis, smooth brome, and this is a non-native species, but it's guaranteed to be in almost everybody's landscape. Now, there's a fairly open panicle, and it's pretty heavy. Like, when I look at it, it doesn't look like a native grass because it's tall, it's robust, it looks like something, from the Midwest or somewhere where it's more mesic. Now, notice that this is a very characteristic ID point for the smooth brome. There's like this crimping in the leaf, this M, and that is a dead giveaway for the identification of smooth brome. And then notice too, studying the ligule and how it reacts with the blade and the stem, we can see that there is some expansion here right above the ligule. We have some expansion of the leaf blade, and it's rolled down below, and it's a papery ligule. It's not a hairy one like we were looking at before. Now, I should have a picture in here to note that smooth brome senesces to this kind of purpley gray color, which to me looks completely different than the color of native grasses senescing in the fall. So if you're looking out, if you're out driving along the highway, and the grass has this purpley gray haze and it's kind of curling, but it's much larger than the blue grama, that's your smooth brome for you. That was planted all over the American West by the the Army Corps of Engineers in the mid-20th century to stabilize riparian banks, reduce flooding so we could colonize these areas. All right, now let's look at needle and thread grass. This is another one that once you get an eye on it, you really can't ever stop looking at it. It's so interesting. So we have, here's the seed here. And these awns, I mean, I mentioned the three-awn as having an excessively long awn, but this is 3 times longer. All of these curls here, these are awns. It's a thread coming from the seed. And you might be able to notice in the picture that it's kind of twisted, and that is a mechanism for drilling the seed into the soil. When it's dry, it's more straightened out, and then as when it's wet, it's more straightened out, and as it dries, it curls up, and that helps to drill the seed into the ground and guarantee reproduction. So if you have a rather tall grass, now this one can be up almost as tall as the turkey foot. Again, it just really depends on how much water and the landscape slope, etc. aspect. But this is a robust grass. This is a tall grass, the needle and thread. Notice that we don't have any really pronounced angles where the blades are emerging from the stem. We have a white papery ligule, so it's not hairy at all, but it's noticeably white, and so that's something to keep track of in your mind. And that is needle and thread grass. And now we have squirrel tail, which is also another non-native, and it's an example of a spike. The florets are very close to the main stem, and here we also have very long awns, but nowhere near as long as the needle thread, and probably about the same length as the three-awn, but it's not 3 awns per seed, it is 1. And as this plant senesces, moving to the right, it does open in a kind of angular way. It doesn't fall open like a panicle, but the awns become more spread out and stiffened. And as you can also see, the grass blades themselves are very rigid and tough, and they are inferior to the inflorescence typically. This plant can be very noxious to livestock and horses because those awns can really get caught up in their gums. So here we have green needlegrass, Nasella viridula, and this is another taller species. It can be taller than me, and I'm 5.5 feet tall, and it's a robust grass, not a ground sponge grass, not a mat forming ground cover. Also, we see the function of the awns here, and these are fairly short awns compared to the 3 species I just mentioned, but it has this robust spikelet, and it's heavy in a way that other native plants are not heavy. And then you can see here how there's so many florets really jam-packed in here, and this is another feature that just makes it look very robust, and it's not delicate. And then also notice here how the blade it's rolling, the leaves are folded and they're inside of the outer blade as they emerge. And that outer blade tends to turn a lighter color rather quickly. And I find that to be a key characteristic, to look for that lightened, rolled outer blade and these folded blades emerging from it. Okay, so now let's look at little bluestem, Schizachyrium scoparium. This is a great grass, so gorgeous. Notice the florets are very hairy indeed, and the whole thing turns this beautiful red-purple color. I don't know why it's called bluestem, it should be called red stem. Also notice that the leaves are emerging in this pattern, alternating pattern, and the leaves are creased, and we see that color change where the grass, even in growing season, is kind of reddish at the bottom and more green, and then it turns all red as the season goes on. But again, here we have the 13-year-old boys attempt to have a beard. they're just these weird, long, wispy hairs emerging from the blades. It's not really a whole cluster of hairs, and they are oddly long, which is a characteristic that you just don't see on very many plants. The last time I mentioned it, I believe, was when talking with the buffalograss, but that's a low, like the shortest grass we have in mat forming. This is a bunch grass. And let's just appreciate again that you can see the awns here in the little blue stem, but they're very delicate, nothing compared to the other species we just looked at. Gorgeous grass. It's so beautiful, and it must love a bit more water than other species because it's sometimes I find it like growing in hedgerows along roads where the sheeting moisture is leaving the asphalt and replenishing the soil right there at the roadside. And so, like, if you drive around the Garden of the Gods, right across from Lot 10 is a great example of that. Just going back down the hill towards the central garden, it's just like two hedgerows of little bluestem, and you really notice it in the fall. Okay, just a few more. Now we have the sand dropseed. So we haven't seen an open panicle since we were talking about the Indian ricegrass, but here we have the open panicle. But what we find is that there are more florets per stem. The Indian ricegrass, each pedicel ends in a single seed. And here we're seeing more florets on the panicle. And then notice this, you just cannot deny. It's so characteristic. The whole thing is already developed and it's inside of the blade. And then right at the point of the ligule, the blade just emerges at this 45-degree angle and comes to a point. And that I haven't seen in any other grasses. There are other drop seeds depending on your elevation. So make sure you check your species. But as far as a characteristic for Sporobolus, this whole thing where the panicle seems like fully developed and then it emerges, that is something that I've noticed. Also notice that the ligule is hairy, and that we see that rolling feature where it's not creased, it looks like it's rolling the blade around the stem. And then this has also been an interesting thing looking at this grass over time, is that the blade emerges and it always looks so short, right? There are other plants where we were just looking at like the little blue stem where all the leaves, all the blades emerging are the same length. And this one is just so weird and short. And then here right at the node, we have this like purple collar. Okay, and now here we go to intermediate wheatgrass. We have lots of wheatgrasses in Colorado. Crested wheatgrass is the real noxious one, and then we have slender and intermediate. And so I believe I've been confirmed in identifying this as intermediate wheatgrass. Slender wheatgrass, to me, the glooms are more alternating and oppressed to the stem. Whereas the intermediate wheatgrass, it appears a bit more robust. And if we got all the way to the crested wheatgrass, which I'm not showing you, the glooms are just kind of sticking out like jazz hands off of the stem. And then the other characteristic thing to note here is like, look at how the blade is coming from the stem in this sort of coiled fashion, whereas before we saw other things, like we saw hair there, we saw a papery ligule, or we saw like the leaf like all of a sudden protrude into a wider morphology. But here it looks like it's kind of unrolling in a spiral fashion. Very thick grass. This is a medium height grass, senesces to a really like characteristic yellow dried grass color. And then finally, all the way here on the right, we see these light yellow colored petals, these beautiful little grass flowers. All right. So, we made it to the end. continue to enrich your mind with knowledge of botanical terms, because I only used about a half a dozen terms, but once you get into Ackerfield or Weber, there are hundreds of words to know. And so just bear that in mind, and try to constantly be teaching yourself the vocabulary. And then, of course, keep these diagrams handy that help you to learn the parts of the plants and the ways to parse them into different groups, like spikelet, like spike, raceme, panicle. What's the ligule? Is it papery or is it hairy? Those kinds of like general parsing details that will really help you if you're working with a limited number of species. Okay, please let me know if you have questions, and we in the next video are going to go through my process of decoding a dichotomous key using a known plant as a means of improving your botanical vocabulary.